Chapter 3. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. The next morning when Anne awoke, she saw that there was a cherry tree in full bloom by her window. Anne dropped on her knees and gazed out into the June morning, her eyes shining with delight. Oh, wasn't it a lovely place? Suppose she wasn't really going to stay here. She would imagine she was. There was scope for imagination here. Anne had looked on so many unlovely places in her life, poor child, but this view of the garden, woods, and fields of the farm was as lovely as anything she had ever dreamed. That day, Anne and Marilla went by horse and buggy to talk to Mrs. Spencer. "I've made up my mind to enjoy this drive," declared Anne as they turned out of the gate. "It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. I'm not even going to think about going back to the asylum during our drive. Oh, look, a wild rose. Isn't it lovely? Don't you wish roses could talk? And isn't pink the most beautiful color in the world? I love it, but I can't wear it. Redheads can't wear pink, not even in imagination. Did you ever know of anybody whose hair was red when she was young but got to be another color when she grew up?" "No," replied Marilla. "And it isn't likely to happen in your case either." "Another hope gone," Anne sighed. "My life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes. I read that in a book. I say it to comfort myself when I'm disappointed. I don't see where the comforting comes in myself." "Because it sounds so nice and romantic, like the name Avonlea. It just sounds like music. How far is it to Mrs. Spencer's house?" 5 miles. And since you insist on talking, you might as well tell me what you know about yourself. Where were you born, and how old are you?" "I was 11 last March," Anne obeyed. "I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father and mother were high school teachers. They were young and poor. My mother died of fever when I was 3 months old, and father died 4 days afterward from fever too. Mrs. Thomas, who took me in, said that I was the ugliest baby she had ever seen. See? Nobody really wanted me even then. She kept me until I was 8, and I helped with all 4 of her children. Then Mr. Thomas died, and she had to move in with her mother. I wasn't invited. So Mrs. Hammond took me to help with her 8 children. She had twins 3 times. I lived with them for 2 years, but then they moved to the United States. I had to go to the asylum because nobody would take me. They didn't want me there either. They said it was overcrowded. But they had to take me, and I was there for 4 months until Mrs. Spencer came. Anne finished up with big sigh. She did not like talking about her experiences in a world that had not wanted her. "Did you ever go to school?" demanded Marilla. "Not much. It was too far away. Except for at the asylum. I can read pretty well, though, and I know so many poems by heart." Marilla looked at Anne. "Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you?" "Oh," Anne's face went red. "They meant to be. I know they meant to be kind. But they had worries, too." Marilla asked no more questions. She just tightened her lips and looked serious. But in her heart, she had begun to pity the child. Could she let her stay? "She talks too much," thought Marilla. But she might be trained out of that. And there's nothing rude in what she does say. She's ladylike, It's likely her people were nice folks." They drove in silence until they reached Mrs. Spencer's big, yellow house by the sea. Mrs. Spencer came to the door with surprise and welcome on her kind face. "Dear me, Marilla, you're the last folks I was looking for today. Hello, Anne." "We can't stay long, Mrs. Spencer, but the fact is there has been a mistake somewhere, and I've come over to see where it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum." "Why, you don't say," said Mrs. Spencer unhappily. "I heard that you wanted a girl. I'm dreadfully sorry. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Come on in, and we'll talk the matter over." Mrs. Spencer showed her guests to the living room. "Perhaps we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Cuthbert. Anne, you sit over here on this bench." "It's our own fault," said Marilla as soon as they were seated. "We should have come to you ourselves and not have let an important message to be passed on by word of mouth. But the mistake has been made. Can we send the child back to the orphanage?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Spencer thoughtfully. "But I don't think it will be necessary. Yesterday, Mrs. Blewett told me she wished she sent for a little girl to help her. She has a large family. Anne will be perfect for her." Marilla looked over at Anne. Her heart softened at the sight of the child's pale face with its look of sadness, like a helpless little creature once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Plus, she did not like Mrs. Blewett. "Well, I don't know," said Marilla slowly. "I didn't say that we had decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, Matthew wants to. I just came to find out how the mistake occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew." Anne flew across the room to Marilla. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables?" she said in a breathless whisper. "Did you, or did I only imagine it?" "You had better learn to control your imagination," said Marilla crossly. "You heard me say that, and no more. It isn't decided yet." "I'll try to do and be anything you want me, if you'll only keep me," said Anne. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla read the look of relief in his face when he saw she had brought Anne back. But she said nothing until they were both out in the yard behind the barn. Then she told him Anne's history and about Mrs. Blewett's request. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that woman," said Matthew. "I agree. And since you seem to want her so far as I'm concerned, Matthew, Anne may stay." Matthew's face glowed with delight. "I hoped you'd come to see it that way. She's such an interesting little thing." "And I will train her to be a useful little thing. You just leave me to manage her. If I fail, you can take over." "As you say, Marilla. Only be as kind to her as you can without spoiling her. I think she's the sort you can do anything with, if only you get her to love you," said Matthew gently. The next morning, Marilla didn't tell Anne that she was to stay at Green Gables. She kept the child busy with various tasks and watched her do them. By noon, she had concluded that Anne was smart, willing and quick, but tended to fall into daydreams in the middle of a task and forget all about it. But Anne hadn't forgotten the burning question in her heart. By afternoon, she couldn't wait any longer. She trembled with fear. "Oh, please, Miss Cuthbert," she said to Marilla, "won't you tell me if you're going to send me away? I've tried to be patient, but I cannot bear not knowing." "You haven't cleaned the dishcloth in hot water, as I told you to do," said Marilla coldly. "Do that before you ask any more questions." Anne went and washed the dishcloth. Then she returned to Marilla with questioning eyes. "I suppose I might as well tell you." Marilla could not find an excuse to delay any longer. "We have decided to keep you, if you be good and try to act grateful." "Why, child, whatever is the matter?" "I'm crying," said Anne, "but I can't think why. I'm so happy." "Sit down and calm yourself," said Marilla. "I'm afraid you both cry and laugh far too easily. You can stay here, but you must go to school in the fall." "Can I call you Aunt Marilla?" asked Anne. "No, call me just plain Marilla, like everybody else." "But we could imagine you were my aunt." "I couldn't," said Marilla. "Do you never imagine things different from what they really are?" "No." "Oh," Anne drew a long breath. "Oh, Miss Marilla, how much you miss." "I don't believe in imagining things," said Marilla. "Now, Anne, when I tell you to do a thing, I want you to obey me at once."